All right, ladies and gentlemen, I hope we're doing well today. Ignore the content. I've borrowed someone's file from the ball bounce animation, and I'm just going to use it to show you how to render correctly. Now, in the past, we had to use Adobe Media Encoder because they did some finicking with the actual After Effects software, but they have reverted their silly changes, and we can actually once again render from within Adobe After Effects. So you can follow this tutorial anytime you need to render something. So once your file is done, definitely make sure that you go ahead and save, because if a file crashes while rendering, it is a guaranteed corrupt file, and you'll have to do all that work over again. So definitely start off by going File, Save As, and then once that's done, we can then come up to File, and we're going to go to the Export option. Now we have an option to push it straight to Media Encoder. This isn't necessary at this stage, so instead we're going to choose the second option, Add to Render Queue. And that's going to open up the render queue in our timeline panel. And you'll see that we've got some options down here. This is where we essentially set the settings of the render as well as where that render goes to, and then we'll have the ability to push that render out. So first things first, under the render settings, this little drop down here, you can just select best settings. If we click on the word best settings, we don't need to go into any details here for this current sort of stage. So best is good enough for now. The next thing that we do need to change over is the output module, and that little drop down there, we want to make sure we have the H.264 option selected. So H.264 is going to create an MP4 file, and this is industry standard. It's going to give us the best quality for the smallest file size. Now I believe the top option here should be the same for all of us. H.264 match render settings 15 megabits per second, and that's good enough for what we're trying to output. So we'll choose that as our output module. And then lastly, we need to set our output to. So we're telling After Effects where to render this information. So you can click on the blue text that says not yet specified, and here you can navigate to where you want that to render to. Now, it's not really a good habit to render to your desktop, so instead I recommend rendering it either to your documents, or if you are going to render to your desktop, then at least sort of set up that there's a folder and just call that your render folder, so that you can render into that. Rendering to your desktop is sometimes unstable. Usually if a file crashes, it happens while we're rendering to the desktop. I'm not smart enough to know why, that's just from my personal experience. So I'll make a folder called my render folder, and I'll have that on my desktop, and I can render into that folder, so that should be safe. And then we need to set our save option. So if you've been saving your file up until now, this will be whatever name you've been calling it, but definitely stick with our correct render, or rather our correct label settings. So that's going to be your name and surname, underscore your student number, underscore, and then the assignment name. So in this case, I'm just going to call this example. And then I can say save. So now we've set all the information, but it hasn't rendered yet. Now we need to come over to these two buttons over here. This button over here is going to push it to Media Encoder. We don't need to do that. So instead we're just going to click on this render button, and that's going to then give us our progress bar, a nice dinging sound at the end, and your render is done. Please make sure that you watch your render to make sure that it has indeed rendered correctly. So if I go over to my desktop and I find my render file, I'll just preview my render to make sure that it does in fact show it correctly. If not, come back into your composition, make sure that the length of your timeline is correct, make sure that your work area encompasses all of your keyframes, because what happens when you render is it renders inside of that gray bar. So if my bar was set to here, for example, it would only render the final portion of that animation. So always be in the habit of checking your render so that you can confirm that it's been done correctly, and then you can submit that render for whatever assignment you're working on. Alright, so that was the render tutorial. Feel free to refer back to this in the future if you ever need to, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Ciao.